The silence after the crying stopped was what haunted Michael Thompson the most. Judge Patricia Williams froze mid-sentence, her gavel suspended in air as the packed Nebraska courtroom held its collective breath, watching a blind German shepherd named Bella make the choice that would change everything. It wasn't supposed to end like this, not with a dog deciding her own fate. The court reporter's fingers trembled above her keys. Camera phones captured the impossible moment. Eleanor Whitman, 74 and sitting in the front row, pressed her weathered hand to her heart as tears streamed down her face. Michael remembered finding Bella 3 months ago, broken and protecting her dying puppies on that rain-soaked highway, back when he thought saving her would be simple, back when he believed love was enough. "Order in the court," Judge Williams whispered, her voice cracking. But how do you restore order when a miracle is unfolding? When America's most famous rescue dog is about to reveal a secret that nobody, not the lawyers, not the media, not even Michael himself saw coming, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Michael Thompson had been a man going through the motions of living. At 68, the retired truck driver existed in the hollow shell that grief had carved from his life. Martha's death 2 years ago from pancreatic cancer had left him rattling around their small Nebraska farmhouse like a marble in an empty jar. The mortgage payment of $890 consumed most of his monthly Social Security check of $1,847, leaving little room for anything beyond survival. Every morning, Michael would sit at their kitchen table, now just his table, drinking coffee from Martha's favorite mug, a chipped ceramic piece that read, "World's Best Wife." He'd talk to her photograph propped against the sugar bowl, telling her about his day before it even began. "Another delivery run to Grand Island today, sweetheart. Wish you were riding shotgun like the old days." The farmhouse, once filled with Martha's laughter and the smell of her famous apple pie, had become a mausoleum of memories. Her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand, her gardening gloves hung by the back door, waiting for hands that would never return. Michael kept everything exactly as she'd left it, as if moving a single item might finally break the fragile thread connecting him to the woman he'd loved for 43 years. His part-time delivery work for Henderson's Farm Supply provided just enough extra income to keep the lights on. 3 days a week, Michael would climb into his aging Ford pickup and make runs between small Nebraska towns, delivering seed, fertilizer, and equipment to struggling farmers who, like him, were holding on by their fingernails to a way of life that seemed increasingly obsolete. The drive along Highway 34 between Grand Island and Hastings had become his meditation route. Rolling fields of harvested corn stretched endlessly under big prairie skies, and Michael would lose himself in memories of better times. He and Martha had driven this same road countless times during their marriage, to harvest festivals, church socials, visits with friends who were now mostly buried in Riverside Cemetery alongside his beloved wife. Eleanor Whitman, meanwhile, was fighting her own battle against irrelevance at Sunset Manor Assisted Living. The 74-year-old retired schoolteacher had moved there after her daughter Linda's death in a car accident 3 years earlier. Linda's children, Eleanor's grandchildren, lived in California now, too busy with their own lives to visit the grandmother who had helped raise them after their parents' divorce. Eleanor's sharp mind remained trapped in a body that the world had decided was no longer useful. She spent her days in the facility's common room, watching other residents shuffle through their final chapters, while she maintained an active presence on Facebook and Instagram, platforms that her grandchildren had taught her to use during happier times. Dorothy Henderson, 81 and recently widowed, completed this trinity of forgotten souls. Her husband Harold's death 6 months earlier had left her questioning whether anyone would notice if she simply stopped getting up each morning. Their small apartment felt cavernous without his gentle snoring, his morning newspaper rustling, his terrible jokes that had made her laugh for 58 years. October 28th arrived with the kind of Nebraska weather that reminded folks why their ancestors had been tough enough to survive on the prairie. Michael Thompson pulled his worn denim jacket tighter as he climbed into his Ford pickup at 4:30 in the afternoon, the sky already threatening an early winter storm. The radio weatherman had warned of possible severe thunderstorms, but Michael had a delivery to make, a load of winter feed supplements to Johnson's ranch outside Hastings. The drive started peacefully enough. Classic country played softly from the truck's aging speakers, and Michael found himself humming along to Hank Williams as familiar farmland rolled past his windows. He'd driven this route hundreds of times over the years, first with Martha beside him when they were young and exploring every back road in 3 counties, later alone on these delivery runs that had become his lifeline to purpose. "Still taking the long way home," he said aloud to Martha's memory, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. "Remember how you used to say I drove like we had all the time in the world? Guess we didn't, did we, sweetheart?" The storm hit Highway 34 like God's own temper tantrum. One minute Michael was enjoying the drive. The next he was gripping the steering wheel as rain hammered his windshield and wind rocked the truck. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the prairie in stark, haunting flashes. He slowed to 30 miles per hour, hazard lights blinking, joining the cautious parade of vehicles creeping through nature's fury. That's when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's roar like a knife through his heart. At first, Michael thought it might be his imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks with power lines. But as he rolled down his window slightly, despite the driving rain, the sound became unmistakable, the desperate, keening cry of an animal in profound distress. "What in the Sam Hill?" Michael muttered, pulling over to the highway's shoulder. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to mind his own business, to stay safe and warm in his truck. But that sound, it wasn't just any animal cry. This was different, urgent, heartbreaking. It spoke to something deep in Michael's chest, a place that had been dormant since Martha's death. The crying seemed to be coming from the drainage ditch that ran parallel to the highway, about 50 yards into the tall grass. Michael grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment, pulled his jacket hood up, and stepped into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through his jeans, and mud sucked at his boots with every step. Lightning illuminated his path in stroboscopic bursts, turning the familiar prairie into an alien landscape of shadows and silver. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. "Is someone out there?" The crying intensified, becoming more frantic, as if whatever was making the sound recognized that help was finally coming. Michael pushed through the wet grass, following the beam of his flashlight and the pull of his heart. 20 yards, 30. Then he saw them. The sight stopped him cold, rain streaming down his face as he took in a scene that would be burned into his memory forever. A German shepherd, clearly female, clearly in distress, was standing over 3 small puppies that couldn't have been more than 6 or 8 weeks old. The mother dog was pitifully thin, her ribs visible beneath a coat that might once have been golden but now appeared dull and matted. But it was her eyes that broke Michael's heart completely, milky white with cataracts, blind as stone, yet somehow still fierce with maternal protection. The puppies were in worse shape. 2 lay motionless on the soggy ground, their tiny bodies barely rising and falling with labored breathing. The third was attempting to nurse, but the mother clearly had no milk to give. All 3 were soaking wet, shivering violently in the cold rain, their body temperatures dropping toward hypothermia. "Dear God in heaven," Michael whispered, dropping to his knees beside them. The mother dog immediately positioned herself between Michael and her babies, a growl rumbling deep in her throat despite her obvious weakness. Even blind, even starving, even at death's door, she was still trying to protect what remained of her family. Michael had seen enough animal suffering during his younger years on various farms to recognize a crisis when he saw one. These dogs had hours, maybe less, before the cold finished what starvation had started. The smallest puppy had already stopped shivering, never a good sign in hypothermia cases. "It's okay, girl," Michael said softly, extending his hand for the mother to smell. "I'm not going to hurt them. I want to help. But you've got to trust me, because we're running out of time." The mother dog's growl faded as she caught Michael's scent, her head tilting slightly as if trying to read his intentions through senses other than sight. For a moment that felt like eternity, human and animal regarded each other in the storm, two desperate souls recognizing something essential in each other. Then the smallest puppy stopped breathing altogether. Michael didn't think, he acted. Years of farm experience kicked in as he scooped up the lifeless puppy, a tiny black and tan male no bigger than his palm. The little body was cold and limp, but Michael had seen enough newborn calves and foals to know that sometimes what looked like death was just the edge of it. He cupped the puppy against his chest, using his body heat while gently rubbing the tiny rib cage with his thumb. "Come on, little fighter," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Don't you give up on me now." The mother dog watched with those sightless eyes, her head cocked at an angle that somehow conveyed both hope and heartbreak. She couldn't see what Michael was doing, but she could hear his gentle voice, feel the careful movements, sense the desperation that matched her own. For 30 seconds that felt like hours. Nothing happened. Then, miraculously, the puppy gasped, a tiny, barely perceptible sound that was nevertheless the sweetest music Michael had ever heard. The little body shuddered, drew another breath, then another. Color began to return to the pale gums. "That's it, buddy. That's it." Michael carefully placed the revived puppy back near its mother, who immediately began licking the small face with urgent, gentle strokes. Her tail gave the faintest wag, the first sign of hope Michael had seen from her. But they weren't out of danger. The storm was intensifying, and the other two puppies were fading fast. Michael made a decision that would change everything. He was taking them all home. Consequences be damned. "I'm going to help you," he told the mother dog, reaching slowly for the two remaining puppies. "I know you can't see me, girl, but I give you my word. I won't hurt them. I won't hurt any of you." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because when Michael gently gathered the puppies into his jacket, the mother dog didn't resist. Instead, she struggled to her feet, swaying slightly, and followed the sound of his movements as he carefully made his way back toward the highway. The truck's heater had never felt more precious. Michael cranked it to full blast and arranged the puppies on the passenger seat, wrapping them in an old moving blanket he kept behind the seat. The mother dog climbed in without assistance and immediately curled around her babies, her body providing additional warmth even though she had little heat left to give. Michael had a choice to make: continue to Johnson's ranch with the feed delivery or race to the nearest veterinary clinic in Hastings. The feed could wait. These lives couldn't. He drove faster than he had in years, hazard lights flashing, occasionally reaching over to check on his passengers. The mother dog had positioned herself so she could feel all three puppies with her body, a living barrier between them and the world. Despite her blindness, her devotion was absolute. "What's your name, girl?" Michael found himself asking as they sped through the storm. "Somebody loved you once, didn't they? Look how good you are with these babies." He noticed the faded collar around her neck, too worn and muddy to read clearly, but evidence that she hadn't always been a stray. The Hastings Emergency Veterinary Clinic was a small, single-story building that looked more like a house than a medical facility, but the lights were on, and the open 24 hours sign glowed like a beacon of hope. Michael parked directly in front and gathered his furry cargo, the mother dog following so closely she was practically touching his leg. Dr. Sarah Chen was a compact woman in her 40s who took one look at Michael's bedraggled group and sprang into immediate action. "Emergency exam room now," she said, leading them down a short hallway. "How long have they been in this condition?" "I don't know," Michael admitted, carefully placing the puppies on the examination table. "Found them maybe 20 minutes ago in the ditch along Highway 34. This little one stopped breathing, but I got him going again." Dr. Chen's experienced hands moved quickly over each puppy, checking vital signs, body temperature, and signs of dehydration. Her face was professionally neutral, but Michael caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested concern. "Severe hypothermia, dehydration, and malnutrition," she said, reaching for warming blankets and IV supplies. "They're in critical condition, but they're fighters." "How's Mama doing?" The examination of the mother dog revealed the full extent of her suffering. In addition to complete blindness from what appeared to be untreated glaucoma, she was severely underweight, dehydrated, and showing signs of having recently given birth to more than 3 puppies. "Where are the others?" Dr. Chen asked quietly. Michael's jaw tightened. "I think we both know the answer to that. The initial treatment would cost $3,200. Money Michael simply didn't have. His credit card was declined at $500, and his checking account held just $347. But as he looked at those tiny, helpless lives fighting for every breath and at their blind mother who refused to leave their side despite her own desperate condition, Michael made another decision that defied financial logic. "Do what you have to do," he told Dr. Chen. "I'll figure out the money somehow." It was 9:30 at night when Michael finally called Henderson's ranch to explain why their feed delivery would be delayed. By then, he was sitting in the clinic's small waiting room, the mother dog pressed against his leg, both of them keeping vigil over 3 puppies who were slowly, miraculously, beginning to stabilize under the veterinary team's care. Neither Michael nor his new companion slept that night. They simply sat together in the fluorescent-lit waiting room, 2 souls who had found each other in a storm, hoping against hope that love might be enough to save what remained of a shattered family. The first photograph changed everything. Veterinary assistant Jenny Martinez had snapped it without thinking. Michael asleep in the waiting room chair with the blind German shepherd's head resting on his lap, both of them maintaining their vigil over 3 tiny puppies in the warming incubator nearby. The image captured something profound. Pure, selfless love in its most vulnerable form. Jenny posted the photo to the Hastings Community Facebook page at 6 in the morning with a simple caption, "This man saved a blind mama dog and her 3 babies from the storm last night. He's been here all night, won't leave their side. Does anyone know who he is? This is what heroes look like." Eleanor Whitman was awake early as usual, scrolling through Facebook with her morning coffee in the Sunset Manor common room. At 74, she'd become surprisingly adept at social media. It was her window to a world that seemed to have forgotten her existence. But this photograph stopped her mid-scroll. Something about the man's weathered face, the dog's trusting posture, the sheer tenderness of the moment, spoke directly to the teacher's heart she'd carried for 46 years. Without hesitation, Eleanor shared the post with her own commentary. "This is what America used to be about. Helping those who can't help themselves. If you know this man, tell him there are people who want to help. If you don't know him, share this anyway. The world needs more stories like this and fewer stories about everything else." Within hours, Eleanor's share had been reshared hundreds of times across Nebraska communities. By noon, it had reached Omaha. By evening, it was trending across the Midwest. The comments poured in, people sharing their own rescue stories, others offering donations, many simply expressing gratitude that kindness still existed in a world that seemed increasingly cruel. Dorothy Henderson saw the post around 3 in the afternoon while sitting in her late husband Harold's recliner, scrolling mindlessly through her phone as rain continued to patter against her apartment windows. As a former veterinary nurse, she immediately recognized the signs in the photograph that others might miss. The mother dog's protective positioning, the clinical setup visible in the background, the exhausted determination written across the man's face. "That dog's been abused," Dorothy said aloud to her empty apartment, her professional instincts kicking in after 6 months of dormancy. "Look at the way she's holding herself. And those puppies." She studied the image more closely, her trained eye catching details that the casual viewer would miss. "They're younger than they should be away from Mama. Something's very wrong here." Dorothy did something she hadn't done since Harold's funeral. She got dressed, called a taxi, and went out into the world with a purpose. Michael, meanwhile, was experiencing a crash course in viral fame without understanding any of it. His old flip phone had been buzzing occasionally, but he'd been ignoring it in favor of monitoring the puppy's progress. It wasn't until a local news crew showed up at the veterinary clinic that he realized something extraordinary was happening. "Sir, I'm Rebecca Torres from K&P News," the reporter said, approaching Michael in the waiting room. "We'd like to talk to you about your rescue last night. The story is all over social media." "Social what now?" Michael looked genuinely confused. "I don't know anything about that. I just found some dogs that needed help." The interview was awkward but authentic. Michael's discomfort with attention only made him more sympathetic to viewers. When Rebecca asked why he'd risked his own safety and financial security for animals he'd never seen before, Michael's answer was simple. "My Martha always said you can't save everyone, but you can save someone. These little ones needed saving." By the time the evening news aired, donations had begun pouring into the veterinary clinic. Dr. Chen, initially skeptical of the media attention, found herself moved by the genuine outpouring of support. A GoFundMe page appeared. Eleanor had created it from her tablet in the Sunset Manor common room, having watched a YouTube tutorial on fundraising. "Save Bella and Her Babies," the page was titled. Eleanor had taken the liberty of naming the mother dog Bella, reasoning that every hero deserved a proper name. The fundraising goal was set at $10,000, enough to cover immediate medical costs and ongoing care. It reached that goal in 18 hours. The puppies, meanwhile, were responding remarkably well to treatment. The smallest, whom the veterinary staff had nicknamed Hope, was gaining strength hourly. The other two, dubbed Faith and Courage by Eleanor in her updates, were beginning to show playful behavior. But it was Bella's transformation that truly amazed everyone. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Chen told Michael during a late-night check-in. "When you're here, her stress indicators drop dramatically. Her blood pressure normalizes, her breathing evens out. It's like your medicine for her." Michael was learning to navigate not just Bella's blindness, but her intelligence. She'd begun responding to his voice with obvious recognition, following the sound of his footsteps around the small examination rooms, positioning herself so she could touch one of her puppies while staying in contact with Michael's leg. Their bond was forming with remarkable speed, forged in crisis but deepening through consistent presence. Dorothy arrived at the clinic on the third day, carrying a worn leather bag that looked older than Methuselah but contained veterinary instruments maintained with religious care. "I'm Dorothy Henderson," she announced to Dr. Chen. "I was a veterinary nurse for 40 years before I retired. I've been following this story, and I think I can help." What Dorothy could provide was expertise in animal behavior and trauma recovery, knowledge that proved invaluable in understanding Bella's needs. "She's not just blind," Dorothy explained to Michael as they watched Bella interact with her puppies. "She's grieving. There were more babies, weren't there? She's mourning the ones she couldn't save." This insight changed how everyone approached Bella's care. Instead of focusing solely on physical recovery, they began addressing her emotional trauma. Michael started spending entire nights at the clinic, sleeping on a cot that Dr. Chen provided. Eleanor visited daily, reading aloud to the dogs, a practice that seemed to calm all four animals. Dorothy began working with Bella on mobility exercises, helping her navigate her blindness with confidence rather than fear. The media attention grew beyond local interest when the story was picked up by the regional Associated Press Bureau. Suddenly, Michael found himself fielding interview requests from stations in Omaha, Kansas City, and Des Moines. The contrast between his simple, genuine responses and the complexity of the modern media landscape made him an immediately sympathetic figure. "I don't understand why everyone's making such a fuss," Michael told a reporter from Nebraska Public Television. "You see somebody in trouble, you help them. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" But not everyone was charmed by the story. On day 5 of the media coverage, Michael received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was gruff, direct, and angry. "You've got my dog," the man said without preamble. "That German shepherd you've been showing off on TV. Her name is Honor and she belongs to me. I want her back, along with the puppies." Michael's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "Richard Blackwell, Master Sergeant, retired. That's my son's dog you stole, and I'm coming to get her." The line went dead, leaving Michael staring at his phone in disbelief. Around him, the veterinary clinic continued its normal operations, but suddenly everything felt different. The sanctuary he'd created for Bella and her family was about to be challenged by someone with legal papers and a claim to ownership that predated Michael's rescue by years. Dr. Chen found Michael sitting in the parking lot an hour later, his head in his hands while Bella sat pressed against his legs, somehow sensing his distress. "We knew this day might come," she said gently. "Dogs this well-trained don't usually end up as strays by accident." "But she chose me," Michael said, his voice breaking. "Look at her. She chose us. Doesn't that count for something?" Eleanor and Dorothy arrived within minutes of Dr. Chen's phone call, forming what would become known locally as Bella's Army. 3 seniors who'd found purpose in protecting a family that had already survived more than any living being should have to endure. "If someone wants a fight," Eleanor said grimly, her tablet already open to legal resource websites, "then we'll give them one." The storm that had brought them all together was nothing compared to the one that was approaching. Richard Blackwell arrived in Hastings like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, though most people saw only the expensive suit and the cold determination in his eyes. At 52, the retired Master Sergeant had learned to present an impeccable facade, pressed khakis, polished shoes, military bearing that commanded immediate respect. But those who looked closer might have noticed the tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching, or the way he avoided looking directly at Honor when he first saw her through the veterinary clinic window. "That's my dog," he announced to Dr. Chen, producing a folder of documents that looked official enough to end any argument. "Her military designation was K9 Honor, service number 347. These are her breeding papers, vaccination records, and military discharge documentation. I've come to take her home." Michael stood frozen in the clinic's lobby, watching this stranger claim the family he'd grown to love as his own. Bella, he couldn't think of her as Honor, not now, pressed against his legs, her blind face turned upward as if seeking reassurance that her world wasn't about to crumble again. "Sir, I understand your legal claim," Dr. Chen said carefully, "but this dog has been through severe trauma. Separating her from the man who rescued her might cause serious psychological damage." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but Honor is military property that was entrusted to my family. My son died serving his country, and this dog was his partner. She belongs with me." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Michael felt his knees weaken as the full implications settled in. This wasn't just a legal battle over ownership. This was a grieving father's claim to his dead son's legacy. Eleanor Whitman, who had been documenting everything on her tablet from the corner chair, looked up sharply. "If she belonged with you, sir, then how did she end up dying in a ditch with 3 starving puppies?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, revealing something raw and painful underneath. "That's not relevant to the current situation," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "It's entirely relevant," Dorothy Henderson interjected, rising from her seat with the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades dealing with difficult pet owners. "This dog shows classic signs of abandonment trauma. Someone didn't just lose her. Someone left her to die." Richard's face flushed red. "How dare you? How dare I what?" Dorothy stepped forward, her 81-year-old frame somehow commanding the room. "How dare I care about an animal that's been through hell? How dare I ask questions about why a trained military dog was found starving in a storm with no identification, no microchip registration, nothing but an old collar that was nearly cutting off her circulation?" The confrontation escalated quickly. Richard's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Lincoln who'd driven down specifically for this encounter, began threatening legal action against everyone in the room. Eleanor started live-streaming the confrontation on Facebook, her followers watching in real time as their beloved rescue story took a dark turn. Dorothy continued her relentless questioning about Honor's condition when found, her veterinary training allowing her to paint a damning picture of neglect. But it was Michael's quiet question that stopped everyone cold. "What was your son's name?" Richard turned slowly, his composure finally cracking completely. "Danny. Sergeant Daniel Blackwell. He was 24 years old when he died in Afghanistan, and Honor was the only thing that came home with him." The pain in the man's voice was unmistakable now, and Michael felt his anger transform into something more complex. This wasn't a villain trying to steal his dog. This was a father drowning in grief, grasping for any connection to his lost child. "Mr. Blackwell," Michael said gently, "I can see how much your son meant to you. But look at her." He knelt beside Bella, his hand finding her familiar spot behind her ears. "She's not the same dog that served with Danny. She's been through something terrible. She needs healing, not more upheaval." Richard's lawyer began to object, but Richard raised a hand to silence him. For the first time since arriving, he really looked at Honor, saw the blindness, the cautious way she moved, the protective positioning around her puppies. Something shifted in his expression. "She wasn't blind when she came back from overseas," he admitted quietly. "The military veterinarians said it was genetic, that it would get worse with age. Danny knew. He made me promise to take care of her." "Then what happened?" Eleanor asked, her live stream audience now in the thousands as word spread about the confrontation. Richard's shoulders sagged. "I couldn't look at her. Every time I saw Honor, I saw Danny loading her into the transport for his final deployment. I saw his face when he said goodbye, telling me to watch over her if anything happened to him." His voice broke slightly. "When the blindness got worse, when she started bumping into furniture, needing constant care, I told myself she'd be better off somewhere else. I told myself I was doing the right thing." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Richard had abandoned Honor because she reminded him too much of his grief, and now that same grief was driving him to reclaim her. "So you just left her?" Michael's voice was carefully controlled, but the hurt was evident. "I took her to what I thought was a good home," Richard said defensively. "A family with kids, a big yard. I gave them money for her care. I thought she'd be happier." Dorothy's expression was skeptical. "When was this?" "6 months ago." "And you never checked on her?" Richard's silence was answer enough. The legal battle that followed consumed the next 3 weeks and captured national attention. The GoFundMe for Bella's care swelled to over $50,000 as supporters rallied behind what they saw as a clear case of moral versus legal ownership. Save Bella Family began trending on social media platforms, with celebrities and politicians weighing in on both sides. Richard's legal position was strong, the documentation was clear, the ownership indisputable. But public opinion was firmly against him, especially after Eleanor's investigation revealed that the family he'd given honor to had surrendered her to a puppy mill operation that had used her for breeding until her blindness made her unprofitable. The discovery of Honor's 6-month journey from Richard's abandonment to Michael's rescue painted a horrific picture. Passed from home to home, used for breeding while blind and frightened, finally dumped with her surviving puppies when she became too sick to be useful. Michael, meanwhile, was learning to navigate a legal system he'd never encountered before. The public defender assigned to his case was overworked and pessimistic about their chances, but Eleanor had connected him with a retired lawyer who specialized in animal welfare cases and was willing to work pro bono. The law is clear about property ownership, Attorney Margaret Walsh explained during their first meeting. But Nebraska has provisions for animal abandonment and welfare that might apply here. The challenge is proving that Mr. Blackwell's actions constitute legal abandonment rather than good faith rehoming. The case attracted attention from animal rights organizations across the country. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse carrying signs reading, "Love Trumps Law" and "Honor Chose Michael." Counter-protesters, mostly military families and veterans, argued that honoring fallen soldiers meant respecting their wishes for their service animals. Through it all, Bella seemed to understand that her future was being decided by others. She grew increasingly anxious as the legal proceedings dragged on, refusing to eat when Michael wasn't present, becoming aggressive toward strangers who approached her puppies. Dr. Chen warned that the stress was affecting her health and potentially her ability to care for her offspring. The most heartbreaking moment came during a court-ordered visitation when Richard was allowed supervised contact with Honor to assess their relationship. The dog's reaction was unmistakable. She cowered, trembled, and tried to hide behind Michael despite her blindness. Even Richard's lawyer seemed shaken by the encounter. "She remembers," Dorothy observed quietly. "Dogs don't forget abandonment." But Richard was fighting his own demons. As the media scrutiny intensified and the details of his abandonment became public, he found himself facing the judgment of the very military community whose values he claimed to represent. Veterans groups began questioning his actions, and his employer, a defense contracting firm, suggested he take indefinite leave. The breaking point came when a reporter discovered that Richard had received a substantial insurance settlement following Danny's death, over $2 million, but had never used any of it for Honor's care. The revelation that he could have afforded the best veterinary treatment for her blindness while instead abandoning her to a life of suffering turned even some of his supporters against him. As the preliminary hearing approached, Michael found himself facing a terrible possibility. He might win the legal battle, but lose the moral war. The stress was destroying all of them: himself, Eleanor, Dorothy, and most importantly, Bella and her puppies. Victory in court might come at the cost of the very family they were trying to protect. The night before the hearing, Michael sat with Bella in the veterinary clinic's quiet examination room, both of them exhausted by weeks of uncertainty. "I don't know what to do, girl," he whispered, his hand finding its familiar place behind her ears. "I love you and those babies more than my own life, but maybe fighting this is hurting you more than helping." Bella turned her blind face toward his voice and did something she'd never done before. She placed her paw on his hand, as if offering comfort instead of seeking it. Outside, Eleanor was updating her Facebook followers about the next day's hearing while Dorothy researched precedent cases on her laptop. None of them knew that Richard Blackwell was sitting in his hotel room 3 blocks away, staring at a framed photograph of his son with honor, finally ready to confront the choice he'd made 6 months ago and the choice he would have to make tomorrow. The Adams County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. By 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the scheduled hearing, protesters lined both sides of the street carrying signs and chanting slogans. News vans from Omaha, Lincoln, and even Denver crowded the parking spaces, their satellite dishes reaching toward an overcast Nebraska sky that seemed to mirror the gravity of the moment. Inside the courtroom, Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the case file one final time, acutely aware that her decision would be scrutinized by a nation divided between legal precedent and moral outrage. At 61, she'd presided over thousands of cases, but none had generated this level of public interest or emotional complexity. Michael Thompson sat at the defendant's table wearing his only suit, the same navy blue outfit he'd worn to Martha's funeral 2 years earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he watched Bella being led into the courtroom by a bailiff. The dog immediately oriented toward his voice, her tail giving the faintest wag despite the intimidating environment. Eleanor Whitman had arrived an hour early to secure a front-row seat, her tablet ready to document every moment for the thousands of followers who had invested emotionally in this story. Dorothy Henderson sat beside her, having spent the previous night researching legal precedents for animal abandonment cases, her former nursing precision now applied to legal strategy. Richard Blackwell entered the courtroom flanked by his attorney, his military bearing intact but something different in his demeanor, a heaviness that hadn't been there during previous hearings. The expensive suit remained, but the confident aggression had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like dread. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Williams took her bench. The packed courtroom stood as one, the rustle of clothing and whispered prayers creating a sound like wind through wheat field. "This hearing," Judge Williams began, "will determine the custody of one German Shepherd, currently known as both Honor and Bella, and her 3 offspring. While this may seem like a simple property dispute, the court recognizes the complex emotional and ethical issues involved." Richard's attorney spoke first, presenting the ironclad legal case for his client's ownership. The documentation was overwhelming. Military service records, breeding papers, registration documents that predated Michael's rescue by years. Under Nebraska law, the case should have been straightforward. Richard Blackwell was the legal owner, period. "Your Honor," the attorney concluded, "regardless of the emotional circumstances of the recent rescue, the law is clear. My client has indisputable ownership of these animals, and that ownership was never legally transferred." Michael's pro bono attorney, Margaret Walsh, faced an uphill battle. Her strategy focused on Nebraska's animal abandonment statutes, arguing that Richard's actions 6 months earlier constituted legal abandonment that voided his ownership claims. "Mr. Blackwell didn't just rehome these animals," Walsh argued. "He initiated a chain of custody that led directly to abuse, neglect, and near death. Under state law, this constitutes criminal abandonment, which legally severs ownership rights." The testimony that followed was devastating. Dr. Chen described Bella's condition when brought to the clinic. Severe malnutrition, untreated glaucoma, signs of recent trauma from puppy mill conditions. A representative from the Nebraska Humane Society testified about the puppy mill investigation that had revealed Honor among dozens of breeding dogs kept in substandard conditions. But it was Dorothy Henderson's testimony that proved most damaging to Richard's case. Drawing on 4 decades of veterinary nursing experience, she painted a clinical but heartbreaking picture of systematic neglect. "This dog didn't just lose her sight," Dorothy testified, her 81-year-old voice carrying the weight of professional authority. "She lost her will to live. When Mr. Thompson found her, she was in the final stages of giving up. I've seen it countless times. Animals who've been betrayed by humans they trusted. They stop fighting. Richard's attorney attempted to discredit Dorothy's testimony by pointing out her lack of formal veterinary training, but her detailed knowledge and passionate delivery had already swayed the courtroom. Several spectators were openly weeping as she described Bella's transformation under Michael's care. The turning point came when Michael took the stand. His testimony was simple, honest, and completely without artifice. Qualities that resonated powerfully in the emotionally charged atmosphere. "I didn't set out to steal anyone's dog," Michael said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I just heard crying in the storm, and I went to help. That's what my Martha always taught me. You see someone in trouble, you help them. Doesn't matter if it's convenient or profitable or safe." When Richard's attorney cross-examined him about his ability to provide long-term care for 4 dogs on a fixed income, Michael's answer silenced the courtroom. "Sir, I may not have much money, but I've got time and I've got love, and sometimes that's worth more than all the fancy papers in the world." The most dramatic moment came when Judge Williams ordered Bella brought into the courtroom for what she termed an observational assessment. The plan was simple. Place the dog equidistant between Michael and Richard, then observe her behavior. Bella was led to the center of the courtroom by a neutral bailiff. The room fell completely silent as the blind dog stood motionless, her head turning slightly as she processed the familiar scents and sounds around her. Both men remained seated, neither calling to her or making any gesture that might influence her choice. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, Bella remained frozen. Then, slowly, deliberately, she began to move. Not toward either man, but toward the corner where her 3 puppies waited in a temporary pen. She positioned herself between the pen and the rest of the courtroom, assuming the protective stance that had become her signature behavior. But then something unprecedented happened. One by one, the puppies, now strong enough to walk confidently, climbed out of their pen and moved to their mother. But they didn't stop there. In a coordinated movement that seemed almost choreographed, all 3 puppies walked directly to Michael, sat at his feet, and looked up at him with unmistakable trust. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered comments before Judge Williams restored order. But the message was clear. If Bella represented protective love, her children represented the future, and they had chosen Michael as their guardian. Richard Blackwell watched this display with an expression that cycled through disbelief, pain, and something that might have been recognition. When Judge Williams asked if he wished to make any final statement before her ruling, Richard stood slowly, his face pale but resolute. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell the truth about what happened 6 months ago." His attorney immediately objected, recognizing that his client was about to destroy their case, but Richard waved him off. "I didn't find Honor a good home," Richard continued, his voice growing stronger. "I drove her to the county line and let her out of the car. I told myself she'd find her way to a farm, that someone would take her in. But the truth is, I abandoned her because I was a coward, because looking at her reminded me that I'd failed my son." The admission hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Eleanor stopped typing on her tablet. Dorothy's hand flew to her mouth, and Michael closed his eyes as if absorbing the weight of Richard's confession. "Danny made me promise to take care of Honor," Richard continued, tears now flowing freely. "And I broke that promise because I was too weak to deal with my own grief. I don't deserve to have her back. I never deserved her in the first place." Judge Williams sat in stunned silence, realizing that this case had just transformed from a legal dispute into a public confession that would haunt Richard Blackwell for the rest of his life. The courtroom remained frozen in the aftermath of Richard Blackwell's confession, the weight of his words settling like dust after an explosion. Judge Patricia Williams stared at the broken man before her, recognizing that she was witnessing something far beyond a legal proceeding. This was a human soul confronting its deepest failure in front of hundreds of strangers and millions more watching online. "Mr. Blackwell," Judge Williams said carefully, "are you saying that you deliberately abandoned the animal in question?" Richard's shoulders shook as 24 years of military discipline finally cracked completely. "Yes, Your Honor. I drove her to a dirt road outside McCook and opened the car door. She wouldn't get out at first. She kept looking at me like she was waiting for me to change my mind. But I threw a rock near her to scare her away." Eleanor Whitman's live-stream chat exploded with outrage and disbelief as viewers processed this revelation. Dorothy Henderson sat rigid in her seat, her veterinary nurse's heart breaking as she imagined the terror and confusion that blind Honor must have experienced in that moment of ultimate betrayal. Michael Thompson felt something shift inside his chest. Not triumph, but a profound sadness for everyone involved. He looked at Bella, who had somehow sensed the emotional turmoil in the room and was now pressed against the barrier separating the gallery from the court area, trying to reach him. "Why are you telling us this now?" Judge Williams asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Richard lifted his head, tears streaming down his face, but his voice growing steadier. "Because 3 weeks ago, I saw a photograph on the news of Honor dying in a ditch with her babies, and I realized that I hadn't just failed my son, I'd become the kind of person he would have despised. Danny didn't die so I could live as a coward." The revelation sent shockwaves through the military families who had supported Richard's custody claim. Retired Sergeant Major Patricia Collins, who had organized veterans to support Richard's case, stood up in the gallery and walked out without a word, her disgust evident in every step. But the courtroom drama was far from over. As Richard's lawyer frantically whispered damage control strategies, another figure rose from the back of the room, a woman in her 50s wearing a nurse's uniform who had been sitting quietly throughout the proceedings. "Your Honor," the woman called out, "I need to speak. My name is Linda Morrison, and I was working at the McCook Animal Shelter 6 months ago when we received reports of a German Shepherd wandering Highway 6. Judge Williams, already far beyond normal courtroom protocol, allowed the woman to approach. "We got 3 different calls about a blind dog causing traffic problems," Linda continued. "When our officers finally caught her, she was terrified, dehydrated, and had been hit by at least 1 vehicle. We could see tire marks on her fur. We held her for the required 72 hours, but no one claimed her." "What happened then?" Judge Williams asked. Linda's voice grew hard. "A man came in claiming to represent a German Shepherd rescue organization. He had proper paperwork, references, the whole setup. He took Honor and promised she'd go to a loving family specializing in blind dogs." She turned to face Richard directly. "That man sold her to Midwest Breeding Solutions, the puppy mill where she was found 3 months later." The courtroom erupted in angry shouts as the full scope of Honor's journey became clear. Richard had abandoned her. She'd been rescued by Good Samaritans, then betrayed again by someone exploiting the system designed to protect her. For 6 months she had been trapped in a breeding facility, forced to produce litter after litter while slowly starving and losing what remained of her sight. "That's why she was so protective of the puppies when I found her," Michael said suddenly, the pieces clicking together. "She'd lost so many babies before these 3. They were all she had left." Dr. Chen, who had been observing from the gallery, stood up and asked permission to speak. "Your Honor, I'd like to add some medical context. Based on Honor's physical condition and the puppy's development, I believe they were her final litter. The malnutrition and stress had damaged her reproductive system beyond repair. If Mr. Thompson hadn't found them when he did, she would have died trying to keep these 3 puppies alive." The emotional weight in the courtroom had become almost unbearable. Eleanor Whitman was openly sobbing as she typed updates to her followers, while Dorothy Henderson sat stone-faced, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. But the most surprising development was yet to come. Richard Blackwell stood up again, this time with a different expression on his face, not the broken confession of moments before, but something that looked almost like resolve. "Your Honor, I want to withdraw my custody claim," he announced, ignoring his lawyer's frantic objections. "But I also want to do something else." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather folder. "This contains my son's final letter to me, written 3 days before he was killed. I've never shown it to anyone, but I think it's time." Judge Williams accepted the folder and read silently, her expression changing as she processed the contents. When she finished, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Blackwell has shown me a letter from Sergeant Daniel Blackwell, written shortly before his death. The court will now read a portion of this letter into the record." She cleared her throat and began to read in a voice thick with emotion. "Dad, if something happens to me and you're reading this, I need you to promise me something about honor. She's not just my partner or my dog, she's family. And family means loving someone even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when it reminds you of everything you've lost. If she comes home without me, don't keep her because you have to. Keep her because you love her. And if you can't love her the way she deserves, find someone who can." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the protesters outside seemed to pause in their chanting, as if the weight of a dead soldier's words had reached through the courthouse walls. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice now steady and clear, "my son was a better man than I've been. He understood what I forgot, that love isn't about holding on to what's yours, it's about doing what's best for those you care about." He turned to face Michael directly. "Mr. Thompson, I can never undo what I did to Honor, and I can never make up for the months of suffering my cowardice caused her. But I can do one thing. I can honor my son's real wishes instead of my own guilt." Richard walked over to where Bella stood at the courtroom barrier, her blind face turned upward as she tracked his approach by sound and scent. For a moment, man and dog regarded each other across the gulf of their shared pain. "I'm sorry, Honor," Richard whispered, his hand hovering just above her head without making contact. "I failed you, and I failed Danny. But I won't fail you again." He turned back to Judge Williams. "Your Honor, I formally and permanently relinquish all ownership claims to Honor and her offspring. Furthermore, I want to establish a trust fund for their ongoing care." He produced another document from his jacket. "This is a bank draft for $500,000 from my son's life insurance settlement, money I should have spent on Honor's care months ago." The courtroom exploded in gasps and scattered applause, but Richard wasn't finished. "I also want to establish the Daniel Blackwell Foundation for Military Working Dog Rescue and Rehabilitation. Mr. Thompson, if you're willing, I'd like you to serve as the Foundation's Director of Animal Care." Michael sat stunned, trying to process this complete reversal of fortune. Minutes ago, he'd been facing the loss of his new family. Now he was being offered the resources to help hundreds of animals like Bella. "Why?" Michael asked simply. Richard's answer came without hesitation. "Because Danny was right. Sometimes loving someone means letting them go to where they'll be happiest. And because watching Honor choose you 3 weeks ago was the first time since my son's death that I've seen what love actually looks like." Judge Williams, recognizing that the case had resolved itself in ways no legal precedent could have anticipated, made her official ruling. The court finds that through his own admission, Mr. Blackwell legally abandoned the animals in question 6 months ago. Custody is hereby awarded to Mr. Michael Thompson with all rights and responsibilities thereof. But the legal resolution was overshadowed by what happened next. As court officers prepared to escort everyone out, Bella did something that surprised even those who knew her best. She walked slowly to Richard, sat down in front of him, and gently placed her paw on his shoe, not seeking attention but offering forgiveness. Richard knelt down and for the first time in 6 months touched the dog his son had loved. "Thank you," he whispered to her. "Thank you for teaching me what Danny tried to tell me. The image of a broken man finding redemption through a blind dog's grace would become the lasting symbol of a case that had captured the nation's attention." Eleanor's final live stream post garnered over 2 million views, but it was her simple caption that people remembered. Sometimes, the greatest victory isn't winning, it's learning how to forgive. As the courtroom emptied, 3 generations of unlikely friends, Michael, Eleanor, and Dorothy, stood together with their extended family of 4 dogs, watching Richard Blackwell walk away into an uncertain future that he would now face with the knowledge that his son's memory was finally being honored properly. The legal battle was over, but the real story of healing, redemption, and the power of love to transform even the most broken souls was just beginning. 6 months after the courtroom that changed everything, Michael Thompson stood in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows of what had once been his lonely farmhouse and marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The kitchen that had echoed with silence for 2 years now buzzed with activity as Dorothy Henderson prepared breakfast while simultaneously monitoring the feeding schedule for 3 adolescent German shepherds who had grown into magnificent, intelligent animals under her expert care. Eleanor Whitman sat at the kitchen table that had once held only Michael's solitary coffee cup and Martha's photograph, her tablet propped against a vase of fresh flowers as she managed the social media accounts for the Daniel Blackwell Foundation. At 75, she had become an unlikely internet celebrity with over 300,000 followers who hung on her daily updates about the rescued animals that now called the expanded property home. "Hope just passed her therapy dog evaluation with flying colors," Eleanor announced, reading from an email. "The Veterans Hospital in Omaha wants to schedule her first official visit next week." She looked up at Michael with the satisfied smile of someone who had found her life's purpose in the most unexpected way. That makes all 3 of them certified now. Hope for therapy work, faith for PTSD support, and courage for mobility assistance. Michael nodded as he watched the 3 dogs in question playing in the fenced yard that had been professionally designed to accommodate Bella's blindness while giving her children room to run and explore. The contrast between these healthy, confident animals and the dying puppies he'd found in that storm-soaked ditch sometimes seemed impossible to believe. Bella herself had become something of a miracle in the veterinary community. The surgical procedures funded by Richard's trust fund had restored 15% of her vision, not enough to navigate independently, but sufficient to see light, shadows, and the general shapes of the people she loved. More importantly, her emotional healing had progressed beyond Dr. Chen's most optimistic projections. "She's not just surviving anymore," Dorothy observed, following Michael's gaze to where Bella supervised her offspring's play with the quiet authority of a queen mother. "She's thriving. Yesterday I caught her playing with that rope toy, actually playing like she's remembering what joy feels like." The Daniel Blackwell Foundation had rescued and rehabilitated 47 military working dogs in its first 6 months of operation, each animal finding placement with veterans who understood the unique bond between soldiers and their 4-legged partners. The Foundation's headquarters, built on land adjacent to Michael's property, employed 12 full-time staff members and had attracted national attention from animal welfare organizations. Richard Blackwell visited the Foundation once a month, never announced, usually arriving early in the morning when only Michael and the dogs were awake. These visits had evolved from painful obligations into something approaching friendship. 2 men who had found healing through their shared connection to a dog that had taught them both about the true nature of loyalty. "He's doing better," Michael told Dorothy and Eleanor during one of their morning planning sessions. "Quieter than he used to be, but better. He's been volunteering at the VA hospital in Lincoln, working with veterans who are struggling with PTSD. Says Bella showed him what it looks like to survive trauma and still trust people." The transformation in Eleanor had been equally remarkable. Her estranged grandchildren had reconnected after seeing their grandmother's story on national news, leading to regular FaceTime calls and plans for a summer visit. More importantly, Eleanor had discovered a gift for Grant, writing and nonprofit management that had helped the foundation secure over $2 million in additional funding. "I spent 46 years teaching children," she told a reporter from USA Today. "Turns out teaching the world about compassion uses the same skills, just on a bigger scale." Dorothy's renaissance had surprised everyone, including herself. At 82, she had become the foundation's head of veterinary services, working with animal behaviorists and medical specialists to develop protocols for treating traumatized military working dogs. Her combination of old-school veterinary nursing experience and fierce protective instincts had made her indispensable to the operation. "Harold always said I had more fight in me than sense," she laughed during an interview with the Hastings Tribune. "Turns out that's exactly what these animals needed, someone willing to fight for them when they couldn't fight for themselves." The ripple effects of Bella's story had extended far beyond Nebraska. Congress had passed the Bella Act, legislation that provided funding for military working dog retirement and rehabilitation programs. 3 universities had established veterinary scholarships in Honor's name, and animal shelters across the country had reported increased adoption rates as people sought to create their own rescue stories. Michael's relationship with Martha's memory had evolved as well. Her photograph still occupied its place of honor on the kitchen table, but now it was surrounded by pictures of the extended family that had grown around it. Eleanor at Bella's first therapy dog certification, Dorothy teaching a puppy to navigate stairs, Richard smiling genuinely for the first time since his son's death as he watched Hope comfort a struggling veteran. "I used to talk to Martha's picture because I was lonely," Michael confided to Dr. Chen during Bella's regular checkup. "Now I talk to her because I want to share how full our life has become. I think she'd be proud of what grew out of all that pain." The house itself had been transformed to accommodate its new purpose. Ramps and tactile pathways helped Bella navigate independently, while professional-grade veterinary equipment in the converted barn allowed for on-site medical care. The guest bedroom where Dorothy now lived permanently had become a sanctuary, filled with the quilts she'd started making again after years of creative dormancy. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the simple fact that no one in the house was lonely anymore. Evenings that had once stretched endlessly for 3 isolated seniors now flew by in a blur of dog training, foundation planning, and the comfortable companionship of people who had found their tribe in the most unexpected way. "You know what I realized?" Eleanor said one evening as they sat on the expanded front porch, watching Bella guide her children through their evening routine. "We all thought we were saving her, but she was saving us. Michael from his grief, me from my irrelevance, Dorothy from her depression, even Richard from his guilt." The foundation's success had brought numerous speaking opportunities and media requests, but the core group rarely traveled together, preferring to maintain the routine that had brought such stability to all their lives. When they did accept speaking engagements, it was usually Eleanor who served as spokesperson while Michael and Dorothy preferred to work behind the scenes. "I'm not much for crowds," Michael told a documentary filmmaker who had requested an interview. "But if telling our story helps other people understand that it's never too late to start over, then I guess it's worth the discomfort." The annual memorial service for Sergeant Daniel Blackwell had become a foundation tradition, held each October on the anniversary of his death. Veterans, rescued dogs, and their new families gathered at the Foundation headquarters to honor not just Danny's sacrifice, but the healing power of the human-animal bond that his death had ultimately helped create. As winter approached Nebraska again, exactly 1 year after that storm-soaked night that had changed everything, Michael found himself looking forward rather than backward for the first time since Martha's death. 3 more military working dogs were arriving the following week, and the Foundation had been selected to pilot a new program pairing rescued animals with elderly veterans in assisted living facilities. "Martha always said everything happens for a reason," Michael told Bella as they took their evening walk around the property, her partial vision allowing her to enjoy the changing colors of autumn leaves. "I used to think that was just something people said to make sense of senseless pain. Now I think maybe she was right. Maybe sometimes the worst storms bring the most important rescues." Bella's tail wagged as if she understood, and in the distance, her 3 children played in the gathering twilight, their joy a testament to the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. At 68, Michael Thompson thought his story was over, widowed, alone, just going through the motions of living on Social Security in rural Nebraska. Then, a blind German shepherd named Bella, abandoned and dying with 3 puppies in a storm, changed everything. What started as a simple rescue became a miracle that united 3 generations: Michael, Eleanor, 74, and Dorothy, 81. 3 forgotten souls who discovered that sometimes your greatest purpose comes after everyone thinks you're past your prime. Together, they built the Daniel Blackwell Foundation, saving dozens of military dogs while finding the family they never knew they needed. Eleanor went from lonely widow to social media influencer with 300,000 followers. Dorothy transformed from depressed senior to head of veterinary services at 82. Michael evolved from isolated widower to foundation director, proving that love multiplies when you're brave enough to share it. Their story isn't just about rescuing dogs. It's about discovering that your most meaningful chapter might be the one you haven't written yet. Whether you're 55 or 85, whether you feel forgotten or invisible, remember this: Bella couldn't see, but she could feel love. Sometimes that's all we need to find our way home to purpose, family, and joy we thought were lost forever. What moment in your life felt like an ending, but became a new beginning? Have you ever discovered unexpected purpose in helping others when you thought your productive years were behind you? Share your story below. Your experience might be the encouragement someone else needs to take their own leap of faith.